Hi, everybody. I'm here today with Marc Schotland and Ryan Fernandez with Moab Paper, also with Legion Paper. They'll explain a little bit about the relationship with the way that works in a minute. And we're going to have a short conversation today, hopefully one of a few more that we'd like to do, to talk a little bit about photographic papers and how do you select a photographic paper, what's behind a paper, and what makes a paper different. So I'd like to kind of go right into it, and I think the first thing I'd like to do is talk a little bit about Moab papers. I've been using Moab papers for quite some time, and it's always been a good paper to work with. Obviously, I also print with some other papers. Can't hide that. I certainly talk about it, but the Moab's always been one of my favorite. And over the last year or so, Moab's released a number of new and different surfaces, and they're quite good. But I've had a discussion with Marc in not too distant past in regards to what are the differences in the papers. I don't quite understand what's a brightener, what's meant by all the terms that go into a paper. So, Marc, I'm going to throw it in your lap. Ryan, yours too, in regards to telling us a little bit about this and get us started. And let's kind of start like we don't know a lot of things, kind of the beginner side of things, because we know different papers and we can look at the papers when we go look at paper samples at the store, but we really don't know what we're looking at. There's paper thickness, which is measured in GSMs. Then they have mils, and then you've got some of the surfaces and brighteners and things like that. So maybe kind of going over some of the technical terms and what's involved in making a paper and coding a paper and doing that. Gentlemen?
Okay, that's probably best to start about who we are and what our role is in this whole industry. So you mentioned Legion Paper and Moab Paper. Legion Paper is the overall company, and Moab Paper represents the digital or the inkjet arm of our company. Legion Paper, we're the largest supplier, manufacturer, and distributor of fine art papers in the world. And we produce papers and supply papers into 17 different markets, digital just being one of them. And what that gives us is the capabilities and the flexibility to work in all these different markets and to choose new substrates and new coatings from one market and apply it to another. So that gives us an advantage to innovate and to develop new products that we can bring into the photo industry that they have never seen before. You want to add anything?
No, I think that's well said. I mean, that kind of speaks to who we are as a company and how we make papers. If you're starting at the beginning, how do you pick a paper? I mean, we always say sample box, right? So we just did the Photo Plus show and people come to the booth. Where do I start? I don't know paper. I just got a printer. Best way to dip your toe into the water, get a sample box, get all the papers we make, because there's a lot of genres of paper. There's matte papers, there's photo papers, there's metallics now, there's canvas. So we say, get a sample box, we have 2 sheets of everything, print the same image on all those papers, and then look at it subjectively and say, all right, this is my work, and it works best on these papers. This is the kind of photography I do. So I can't, a lot of people will come to you and say, tell me a paper to use. And it's really a loaded question. You really have to explore the depths of papers that are available to you, not just ours, everybody's. And expand your horizons. So then that'll help you find kind of the genres of paper you like. Or you might steer away from metallics. You might be more of a fine art matte person, 100% cotton. So we always say to test everything first. Because in the end, it's your opinion that counts, not ours.
And then there are many different aspects that go into making a paper. There's the thickness of the paper, the texture of the paper, the color of the paper, the brighteners, as you mentioned. So all these factors contribute to the overall end product that you receive in your hands. So what gives us that ability is that we're producing papers for drawing or printmakers that are outside of photography. And we can take those innovations and then produce our Moab range of papers. And a good example of that is our Slick Rock Silvers. It's a product that we came out with about a year ago that took something that was in the packaging industry. We created our own coating and our own base paper and applied it to inkjet, something that's never been done before. So that gives us that ability to bring some fun new products to the world of photography that hadn't existed before.
Yeah.
So you asked us to touch on some of the basics of paper, such as thickness, which here we measure in MIL, the millionth of an inch, which is also known as the caliper of a paper. So you have very thick papers and very thin papers. Moab papers are primarily on the heavier side, the fine art side. There's some factors that people associate with fine art, and thickness is one of them. Some of them are the weight of the paper, which we measure in GSM, or grams per square meter. That's literally taking a square meter of paper, putting on a scale, and that weight in grams is that final measurement. So if you see a 300-gram GSM paper, that means that that square meter of that paper weighs 300 grams.
All right, now, so essentially, you really need to look at two things then, the thickness and the GSM.
Yeah, because you can have like a luster paper, 260 GSM could have a 10 mil, thickness of 10 mil. And you can have another 260-gram paper made out of cotton that would have a 22 mil, just because the cotton fibers are a little bit thicker, it's a little bit more lush.
Right.
And so the grammage and the caliper are two differentiating factors.
For instance, our Slick Rock Silver and the Entrada are both 300, or one of the Entradas, two of them, are 300 GSM. The Entradas could be thicker than the Slick Rock Silver. The silver is a far more dense paper. So just in terms of caliper, you're looking at Entrada being a little bit thicker. But really, if you look at the GSM, they're equal.
Okay.
So I would say density or the GSM kind of plays more into the rigidity of a paper. And then the caliper might be more of a printer setting issue, or it'll tell you exactly how thick things are. So the two sort of different things, but correlated.
Let me ask you a question. Somebody had put a question on the forum recently in regards to, I forget exactly how they put it, but it's kind of like the half moons. Like if you've got a piece of paper and it's a big piece of paper, where that crinkle point is where you might get a crease if it just bends the wrong way. And somebody said that has a lot to do with the thickness of the paper in regards to, where it's not so flimsy that it begins to hold itself and have a rigidity. If you were looking at a really nice fine art paper, what would you suggest being, a mill that you should look at? Like your Entradas, what's the thickness of those?
That's about there's one that's a 15 mil, which is the 190 gram, and the 300 gram is right about 18 or 19 mil. It depends on what the artist is going to do with their print. For example, if fine art papers, we're selling the tactile quality or characteristic of a paper, something you can hold and touch that feels beautiful. If you're framing it, you're putting it behind glass, you eliminate that ability for somebody to actually touch it. But what comes through that glass is the subtle texture, not necessarily the weight, but the texture, the color of the paper, and the overall just character, the look of the paper. So if you're using it in a portfolio, or if you're selling a print to somebody, then you're going to take that weight into consideration, especially if you're leafing through that and you're feeling the paper. We talk to a lot of wedding photographers, and they're always looking a way to upsell their work. A lot of them submit their images to a lab, they get it printed, they get it sent back, and it's a nice luster or a matte photo. But how do you upsell that person? And one way to upsell it is through that luscious quality of holding a print that has value to it. And that's where the mill, or the thickness, and the overall texture of the paper comes into play.
And to that point, when you're doing an album, really it depends on the album you're doing too. If the pages need to fold and lay flatter, you're going to want a thinner paper. If you really want that tactile feel, our 300 gram also has a little more texture than our 190. You have more fiber there. Mm-hmm. So it does look slightly different than 190. So that might be the look you're going for, and you want a little more hand to it, or rigidity. And then you go that one. But there's no blanket statement to say which one to use, but there's recommendations we make based on the application.
A lot of times you hear the term, cotton and rag thrown out there. Exactly what does that mean in regards to all this too?
Well, the cotton are not those puffy white flowers that you see growing in the field that we harvest and cut down and clear out acres of land to do. This is reclaimed fiber from the textile industry. So it's actually one of the best eco stories out there because it's not cutting down trees. Mm-hmm. It's reclaiming fiber from textile and from the shirts that we're all wearing. This falls onto the floor. We're not taking the shirts and throwing them into a big machine and chopping them up. We do buy the cotton linters on the market, but it's something that's reclaimed. It's something that we're not harvesting from virgin cotton.
Okay.
So rag is an old term that refers back to the rags from the shirts in the textile industry. And that's why it's synonymous with cotton. And so that's why you sometimes see those terms even in our names. It's of our papers. It's a Somerset Museum rag, or it's an Entrada rag. So that's kind of where it comes from, that term.
Now, in the olden days with black and white and color photography, it used to be a fiber-based paper and then a resin-coated paper came out. What are the differences in regards to those traditional papers that some people may remember to what the papers are today that you guys make?
So there's a trend right now to mimic those papers that everybody remembers from the darkroom days, from the wet room days. Yep. And there's two ways to do that. Through the resin-coated, the RC-based paper, which is usually your glossy or luster papers, which have been around for quite a while, and it's taken for granted that most paper companies have those RC papers, which is just a kind of a plastic coating that gives you that E-surface that we all loved when we yep. took our film to a lab and got the prints back. What's really trendy right now is trying to mimic those fiber papers, those cotton fiber papers from the darkroom days, and using the chemical compositions to not only have that feel and look, but also the smell of those papers. And that's where we get the term Brightening from. And most manufacturers have Brightening papers in their portfolio of products, and Brightening is just the term of the chemical composition of barium sulfate. And it is something that allows a manufacturer to control the color or the color of the paper without adding any optical brighteners into it. It's a way to produce a paper with, whether it be warm or cold. You can control the color temperature of the paper, but without really affecting the longevity by adding optical brighteners to it. And these are the same chemical composition that was used in the wet room papers as well. And so we're applying those to these digital papers. And the one that we just launched is the Juniper Beretta Rag. And it says 100% cotton paper, just like the wet room papers. It uses a barium sulfate coating, just like the wet room papers. And it has a very nice heavy weight and feel to it, and also the smell. Some people like it, some people don't, but it's a true paper that will bring people back to when they're spending hours upon hours in the darkroom.
Oh, so now we have another sense that we need to deal with in buying our papers. And how well it
it's a scratch and sniff.
That's
right. Do me a favor. Let's go. Sorry.
No, I was just going to speak to a couple of things. You know, we're starting in the basics of printing and papers and things like that. Mark had mentioned, was talking about rag and then talking about OBA. So for those who don't know what OBA is, optical brightening agent, it's basically something that makes it look brighter than it actually is optically to the eye. There's a debate on whether how their capability of OBAs. The theory is that over time those OBAs will fade and revert back to the natural state of the paper. So Entrada comes Entrada Bright, Entrada Natural. Natural has no OBAs at all. Papers have been around long enough to see those brighteners actually fade, but in theory, when they do, they should look exactly like Entrada Natural by the end of the fading process. So that's essentially what OBA is and how it applies to our industry. And then, cotton, we talked about cotton as a whole. What does that mean? Rag. But what does it mean in terms of using it and the genre of papers? Typically, you can get a nicer feel to cotton papers than any other fiber out there. It's very soft, just as you would think of cotton. So for the tactile application, it's a very popular substrate to work with. And it's also a little more, if you're putting it into album, you're scoring it, you're converting it somehow, it's much more usable in that form.
Now, you have two surfaces. In typical printers, especially for those that aren't doing printing and are thinking about getting into it. Many of the printers have both what they call a photo black and a matte black. How does that relate in regards to how the ink goes down on a paper? Or different papers have different ways to absorbing things, or is it the regard to how it lays on top of a coated paper?
Yeah, in general terms, the photo black is used for the glossy and luster papers, and matte black is used for all the matte papers. So that's just two separate settings on your printer that you're going to select. And also, when you're using our profiles, and I'll talk about profiles in a minute, you need to select which media type you're using so it can tell the printer which ink set to use.
Okay.
If you're using a matte-based paper, it's going to absorb more ink than a glossy or a luster paper. And therefore, you want to be using the right settings. Otherwise, you're going to get some bronzing on there. You're going to get some results that you not necessarily want. So this ties into ICC profiles, which I just mentioned earlier. So this is a piece of software that you download that all manufacturers offer that allow your printer and your computer to communicate to the paper. So it lays down the right amount of inks and using the right media setting, whether it's a luster or a gloss, based upon that specific machine. The reason why you want this is because you want to best mimic what is appearing on your screen that appears on your paper. So you're not wasting paper, you're not wasting ink. The only way to properly do this is to run in a fully calibrated environment. So that means investing in the tools necessary to calibrate your monitor, to calibrate your printer, to calibrate your scanner. All your devices, all your tools need to be calibrated so they all talk to one another, because what would appear on your screen otherwise would not appear on print. The ICC profile is that piece, that bridge, that communication between all those devices that allow you, that what we've tested in our environment on a fully calibrated environment, we're telling the printers through the software exactly how much ink to put down on our papers. Okay. Now, this is what's called a CAN profile, or a generic profile, something that we do in our environment on your printer. It's not necessarily exactly your environment because your printer is in a different humidity setting, it's in a different environment, but this gives you the best starting possibility. The best type of profile is something that you would have, you generate yourself, or you have somebody create specifically for your workflow.
Yeah, we're going to be doing a lot in regards to that, both probably, specifically right now we've had discussions with Spider in regards to the nice kit they sell, which allows you not only to calibrate your monitor, but to generate test targets and calibrate and profile your papers. So we'll get into more of that on the side. But I have found in my use with your profiles that they're pretty much dead on in regards to producing something that you got to be 95% close. I mean, it's these days. I've watched people actually make their own profiles that I didn't think printed as well as profiles that are made and sent by the manufacturer. And there's also something we'll cover more in a separate video elsewhere, is that there's the rips that come out like Image Print by Colorbyte, and the profiles they make that are really nice, and they actually not only calibrate by the type of paper, but by the light viewing that the paper will probably be in when it's put in, like is it going to be under tungsten or daylight and so forth. So there's a lot of variables to look at there. In regards to paper, one of the things that you mentioned and a lot of people might not be familiar with is what's called bronzing. So maybe you could kind of define bronzing. It used to be a lot more prevalent, but we don't see it that much anymore. How would you describe that in regards, and how come it seems to have improved or basically gone away?
Bronzing is essentially, it's more noticeable on gloss and luster papers,
yep,
primarily because the inks that were used laid down too much, whether it's too much of the black or too much of a certain color. Not necessarily always associated with the profile being used. It's just also the innovations of the machine and the types of inks that are being laid down. So a bronzing almost literally means what it sounds like, is that you look at a print, you angle it a little bit, and it kind of has a sheen to it that's not part of your print. It looks a little brownish, and it just kind of, it's a little bit annoying. And so you saw a lot of this in the early days, the 2000p printers with the pigment inks, which are large particles that would lay down on your print, and then as the technology improved, it started to disappear, this issue. With the new printers that are out now, the P800 and the Pro 1000, they with 12 ink sets, or I can't remember how many there are, it really reduces that effect, because not only has our technology to produce better profiles come about, but also their ability to lay down the right amount of ink and smaller ink particles and innovations over time.
It's also called metamerization, right?
Well, that's something a little bit different. Yeah, that's something that.
That's almost a bronzing, but it is different. Maybe we should talk about that, because obviously somebody's going to ask that question. So
now I brought it up.
Now you brought it up. Thank you very much. I just if you bring a print in a indoor setting and you take that print to UV light or next to a window, the colors will shift.
Right.
And so that's basically what it is. And again, improvements over time. There are problems in the early generations of Epson machines, but ink technologies has pretty much eliminated a lot of that issue.
I haven't seen either problem in a long time.
No. I've seen it once in a while, very, very seldom, especially on more glossier papers. And of course, that you really kind of have to have a nice flat lighting that you're tilting the print to, and then so it's not something you see an awful lot of. Outgassing. You hear an awful lot about outgassing, and there's an awful big debate whether a print needs to lie out in the open for an hour or sometimes for a day. So first off, if you folks don't mind, explain what the term outgassing means, and specifically, at least with your papers and probably others, what are we looking at for a period of time that a print should be outgassed before it's either packaged, wrapped, or framed, and so forth?
Yeah, outgassing is essentially that's an invisible gas that is emitted from the inks after a short period of time having been laid onto your print. It's not really specific to any type of paper. It's just specific to the inks themselves. And how this is important to an artist is that they want to let that print breathe. They want to let the gases from from the inks dissipate before you put it behind glass. Because if you frame it too early and these inks start to release their gases, it'll start to fog up your frame, or the glass of your frame. So there's general rules of thumb about outgassing. Some people leave their prints out for a week before they frame it. Some people just do it overnight. It's predominantly thought just to leave it 24 hours before you actually do any framing. That seems to be the general rule of thumb in that sense.
In outgassing, you probably shouldn't stack your prints. They should be face up, separated, and just put on a big table or somewhere.
Yeah, even more applicable for us now, because we're doing a lot of face-mounted papers, or papers being utilized for face mounting. You want to let those breathe, otherwise you're going to cause bubbles when you go to face mount. If you don't.
Now that you bring that word up, face mount, there's a lot of debate about how well face mounting works, and some manufacturers are saying that the warranties are void if you do face mounting, specifically because you're adding the adhesive now directly to the paper surface, and then usually an acrylic substrate that they get mounted to, and all those things obviously contribute to changing the nature of the picture, and specifically how it affects the inks on the top of it. What any experience there? Not that I really want to recommend face mounting, but if you bring it up, and once again, we're going to see it show up on the forum about what goes on. So anything you can share there would be helpful.
For sure. I mean, with any sort of conservative process, or whether it be mat board or face mounting or acrylics, whatever you're using, your end piece is only as good as the materials you use. So if you use a low end, basically face mounting, there's three components. There's the paper, or at least when we do it, the paper, a clear film, and the acrylic. Right. So if you use a lower end film or acrylic, there's the risk of even getting bubbling and gassing out from the acrylic, or it lessening the archivability of the print. But same goes with mat board. If you use a cheaper mat board, something with acid in it, that could happen as well. So face mounting, there's archival ways to face mount, and we know many people who do it for a living. And there's several manufacturers that make both the films and the archival acrylics, that those things are going to last far past anything else out there. We made, specifically for what we've done, we got into face mounting, or we don't do any face mounting, but in that industry, our papers are being applied a lot more for metal paint. So our Slick Rock Silver, which is the only metal paper of its kind, was aimed to attack that direct on metal look. And that's what all the labs are doing. They're, big labs that have literally a rigid piece of aluminum, and they're dye sublimation printing on it. Our process is literally better and more archival in every single way. It's printing with pigment inks on a silver sheet using an archival film and acrylic to then face mount that. So it's not only a better resolution, a better print, you have more flexibility in terms of the sizes you can do, but it's more archival than the other one. So I wouldn't shy anybody away from metal printing or face mounting or things like, silver printing on the Slick Rock, just for longevity sake.
Excellent. Well, maybe what we can do is you can provide me with a couple sources, and we'll put them in the article that accompanies this video for anybody that's interested in learning, who's doing the face mounting that works well with your paper source and your surfaces and so forth. Well, let's go back to your Silver Rock paper for a second, and because it has the word silver in it, many people may take the term that it's a metallic paper, and there is a difference between metallic and silver rock. Is that correct?
Well, there's our slick rock genre of metallic papers.
Okay.
We first had the pearl, and so when many people think about metallic or pearl, they think that white base with sort of a metallic undertone.
Kind of a twinkly kind of thing.
Right, exactly. Looking at it the right light, it's metallic. Looking at another, it looks like a luster or a gloss or something like that. So it's very muddled. When we say Slick Rock, the reason we designated Slick Rock Pearl and Slick Rock Silver is that our silver is actually metal, with a technology on top of it that it's microporous, instant dry. It's the first of its kind like that, but it is actually metal, which is why it can be sold as a metal print. Anybody looking to get into that industry.
It's metal on paper?
Yes. I mean, it's laminated as a backer to give it some rigidity, but the real crux of the line is the metal with the technology that's on top to allow it to be run through a Canon, Epson, and any aqueous printing. So, yes, that one, the pearl is an RC paper, and the metal or the silver is an actual metal paper.
Okay, and it's kind of silver look to it.
Yeah, I mean, it looks like, you take it out of the box, it looks like a sheet of aluminum.
Like gray aluminum or silver aluminum, yeah.
Well, it has two different looks. Now we were talking about face mounting. When you look at it raw, it looks like a very, like a raw piece of metal, very industrial kind of look. If you look at it, if you want a more modern look, you face mount it and it becomes this high gloss piece of aluminum. So it's pretty versatile.
I do want to come back and visit with you guys again in regards to actually pulling some papers out and looking at them and talking about maybe some of the manufacturing processes that go into it and so forth. But in regards to the introduction, we've covered the matte, the glossy. Well, we really haven't talked much about the glossy, but there is a super glossy, which we used to call, I guess in the traditional surface, F surface, and you offer that too, correct?
We do. Yeah, we offer that. It's not the growing part of our papers. It's mostly the matte and cottons and the Brita and the silver that are growing. But we do offer a high gloss paper.
Okay. So there are some people that still would like that for commercial purposes, somewhat, I guess. But just want to make sure that that's there. So anyway, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. Specifically, I want to thank you very much for doing this with us. This is one of our first Skype interviews, and it looks good. I'm sure it'll come out much better on the video, but I wish I could be there. And I actually do hope, as time goes on, that we can meet somewhere and have a discussion over prints. You're always welcome to visit me in Indianapolis and visit the gallery. We got plenty of room to throw paper prints around on big tables and look at some things and have more discussions. But I want to emphasize, not only to you folks, but also our readers, that it's still the print. We've had lots of discussions specifically at Photokina with a number of different people. Even had an extended conversation with Henry Wilhelm in regards to the permanence of prints and what gets left behind. And it's been said a number of times, when you die, your legacy is not what's on the hard drive, but what's in the print drawer. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about making sure that we're making more prints and getting a chance to enjoy what photography always was about, and that was that tactile feel, holding a nice piece of paper in your hand, looking at an image on a wall, but the bottom line, being able to hold it or see it, rather than have to view it, through some sort of computer process, iPads, computers, or whatnot. Yeah. So appreciate your time, and this is where we're going. So put your thinking caps on, and hopefully next time we visit, we can talk a lot more about some of these things in particular.
Great,
guys. I want to thank you once again,
Thank you, Kevin.
For all our readers and everything. Once again, appreciate your time, and we'll see you guys on the Luminous Landscape.